My therapist said I was clearly lying about my childhood trauma. I have recordings of everything that happened. Dr. Vivian Cross leaned back in her leather chair and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before in our 6 months of sessions together. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a medical building downtown, decorated with abstract paintings and degrees from prestigious universities hanging on the walls behind her desk. I just finished telling her about a specific incident from Meadowbrook Group Home when I was 13 years old, describing how Kenneth Brenner locked me in the basement storage room for 18 hours after I reported him for hitting another kid. Dr. Cross set down her notepad and folded her hands in her lap. Caleb, I need to be honest with you. What you're describing sounds like a textbook case of false memory syndrome. These detailed narratives you've been constructing over the past few months, they're not consistent with how actual traumatic memories work. Her voice was calm and clinical, the same tone she'd used when we discussed my anxiety and insomnia. But now there was something else underneath it, something almost dismissive. I felt my stomach drop because I'd been building up the courage for weeks to share these specific details with her. What do you mean, false memories? I was there. I lived through it. Dr. Cross pulled out a different notebook and started writing quickly. Trauma survivors often conflate different events, create composite memories, or unconsciously embellish details to make sense of generalized feelings of distress. The human brain is remarkably unreliable when it comes to childhood memories, especially ones tied to emotional pain. She looked up at me, and her expression was professional but firm. I think what we're dealing with here is a pattern of confabulation. You've convinced yourself these events happened exactly as you're describing them, but the likelihood of you remembering such specific details from over 15 years ago is extremely low. I watched her write something else in her notes, and I noticed she'd moved from her regular session notebook to what looked like a clinical assessment form. Are you saying you don't believe me? Dr. Cross set down her pen and gave me what I assumed was supposed to be a compassionate look. I'm saying that your mind is trying to create a coherent narrative to explain your current symptoms. And in doing so, it's manufacturing memories that feel real but may not reflect actual events. This is actually quite common in patients with your symptom profile. She gestured to her computer screen where she'd been tracking my progress notes. Look at how your stories have evolved over our sessions. Each week, you remember more details, more specific dialogue, more elaborate scenarios. That's not how genuine traumatic memory works. Real trauma memories are typically fragmented, incomplete, lacking in detail. I felt anger rising in my chest, mixing with the familiar anxiety that had brought me to therapy in the first place. So you think I'm making all of this up? Dr. Cross shook her head quickly. Not consciously. I think you believe what you're telling me, but belief doesn't equal truth, especially when it comes to memory. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a small external hard drive that I'd been carrying with me for the past 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it with Dr. Cross. What if I told you I have proof? Audio recordings from Meadowbrook, dozens of hours of them, documenting everything I've told you about. I set the hard drive on the small table between us and watched her face carefully. Her expression shifted immediately from professional concern to something I couldn't quite read. Her eyes fixed on the hard drive and her jaw tightened slightly. Recordings? What do you mean recordings? I explained that when I was 12 years old, a social worker named Monica Reeves had given me a small digital voice recorder, one of those devices that looked like a regular pen but had a microphone built in. Monica had been concerned about reports she'd heard from multiple kids at Meadowbrook, but couldn't get anyone to go on record because we were all terrified of Kenneth Brenner and the director, Gary Westfield. She told me to keep the recorder hidden and turn it on whenever I felt unsafe. Dr. Cross leaned forward in her chair, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. Caleb, recording people without their consent is illegal in most circumstances. Even if these recordings exist, they wouldn't be admissible as evidence of anything. Her voice had changed completely, losing that therapeutic warmth and taking on a defensive edge. And frankly, the existence of recordings doesn't validate your interpretation of events. Audio can be misunderstood, taken out of context, or even manipulated. I picked up the hard drive and turned it over in my hands. I haven't manipulated anything. These are raw files, time-stamped, with metadata showing when and where they were recorded. I have Kenneth Brenner's voice clearly threatening me. I have Gary Westfield telling staff to ignore our complaints. I have evidence of everything I've been telling you. Dr. Cross stood up abruptly and walked to her desk, putting physical distance between us. I think we need to pause here. This is concerning behavior, Caleb. Bringing alleged recordings to therapy, insisting that your memories are accurate despite clinical evidence suggesting otherwise. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a different form, something I'd never seen her use before. I'm going to recommend a psychiatric evaluation. Your fixation on these supposed events, your need to prove them rather than work through them therapeutically, these are red flags for a more serious underlying condition. I felt the room spinning slightly, my heart racing in the way it did when I had panic attacks. You're trying to have me committed because I brought evidence? Dr. Cross turned back to face me, and her expression was completely different now, harder and more guarded. I'm trying to help you, Caleb. But if you continue down this path of attempting to corroborate delusions with fabricated evidence, you're going to do serious harm to yourself. False memory syndrome can destroy lives. You could make false accusations against innocent people, ruin careers, cause irreparable damage. The way she said innocent people made something click in my brain. I'd told her Kenneth Brenner's name multiple times over the past few months. I'd mentioned Gary Westfield and several staff members at Meadowbrook. Why was she suddenly so defensive? Did you work at Meadowbrook? The question came out before I'd fully formed the thought, but the instant I said it, I knew I was right. Dr. Cross's face went pale, and she set down the form she'd been filling out. That's an inappropriate question, and I'm not going to engage with paranoid speculation. But her reaction had confirmed what I'd started to suspect. I pulled out my phone and opened the browser, typing in Meadowbrook Group Home staff history while she watched. It took less than 30 seconds to find an archived page from 2004 showing staff photos. There she was, younger but unmistakable. Dr. Vivian Cross listed as the facility psychologist. You were there. You worked at Meadowbrook when all of this was happening. Dr. Cross walked back to her chair and sat down heavily, her professional composure cracking. I worked there for 2 years as part of my practicum before finishing my doctorate. I provided psychological services to residents. That's public record, and there's nothing sinister about it. Her voice was defensive now, all pretense of therapeutic concern gone. I felt everything shifting into focus, 6 months of therapy sessions suddenly making terrible sense. That's why you've been trying to convince me my memories are false. You were part of it. You knew what Kenneth Brenner was doing, and you didn't stop it. Dr. Cross's face flushed red, and she stood up again, her hands clenched at her sides. That is a serious accusation, and it's completely unfounded. I provided ethical psychological care to every resident at that facility. If there had been evidence of abuse, I would have reported it through proper channels. I shook my head, anger overtaking the anxiety now. But there was evidence. Kids told you what was happening. I remember sessions with the facility psychologist where I tried to explain that Kenneth hurt us, and I was told I had behavioral problems and anger issues. That was you, wasn't it? Dr. Cross's silence was its own answer. She walked to the door of her office and opened it. This session is over. I'm documenting this interaction, and I'm recommending you seek immediate psychiatric care elsewhere. If you continue making defamatory statements, I will have no choice but to take legal action. I grabbed my backpack and the hard drive, standing up to leave. I'm going to the police with these recordings. I'm going to the state licensing board. Everyone is going to hear exactly what happened at Meadowbrook. Dr. Cross blocked the doorway for just a moment, her voice dropping to something cold and threatening. You have no idea what you're doing, Caleb. Those recordings, if they even exist, were obtained illegally. You'll be the one facing charges. And your credibility? A young man with documented mental health issues, making wild accusations against respected professionals? Who do you think people will believe? She stepped aside to let me pass, and I walked out of her office, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the hard drive. In the elevator down to the parking garage, I pulled out my phone and called the one person I'd stayed in contact with from my time at Meadowbrook. Daniel Kovac answered on the third ring. Caleb? Man, I haven't heard from you in months. What's going on? I told him everything as I drove home, my voice breaking as I described Dr. Cross's reaction to the recordings and her threats about psychiatric evaluation. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. Caleb, you need to be careful. There were 7 kids from Meadowbrook who tried to report Kenneth Brenner over the years. 3 of them ended up in psychiatric facilities, diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or early onset schizophrenia. The system discredited them so thoroughly that no one would listen to anything they said. I pulled into my apartment complex and parked, sitting in the car with the engine off. What happened to the other 4? Daniel's voice was grim. 1 committed suicide 2 years after leaving Meadowbrook. 2 disappeared into the foster system, and I lost track of them. And I'm the 4th one. I never reported anything because I watched what happened to the others, and I knew no one would believe me. He paused. But if you have recordings, actual proof, that changes everything. You need to go public with this before they can discredit you. That night, I stayed up until 4 in the morning, listening to the recordings I'd saved on the hard drive, hearing my own 13-year-old voice asking Kenneth Brenner why he was locking me in the basement. Because you're a little snitch, and snitches need to learn their place. Kenneth's voice was clear and unmistakable, followed by the sound of the door slamming and the lock clicking. I'd kept that recorder running for all 18 hours, capturing my crying, my panic, my desperate attempts to get someone's attention. I had recordings of Gary Westfield telling staff to ignore complaints from residents because we were troubled kids with credibility issues. I had audio of Dr. Vivian Cross, younger but definitely her voice, telling another staff member that she'd documented my behavioral problems in my psychological file so no one would take my allegations seriously. The recordings were damning, hundreds of hours of systematic abuse and institutional cover-up, all preserved on a device the size of a pen that I'd hidden in my clothes for 2 years. The next morning, I contacted the law firm that had handled a class action lawsuit against another group home in the state. The paralegal who answered transferred me to an attorney named David Nguyen, who listened to my story without interrupting. Can you send me a sample of these recordings? I emailed him 3 files, carefully selected to show the range of evidence I had. Kenneth Brenner threatening me, Gary Westfield instructing staff to falsify incident reports, and Dr. Cross telling a staff member that she'd make sure my psychological evaluation portrayed me as an unreliable witness. David called me back within an hour. Caleb, this is explosive. If these recordings are authenticated, we're talking about criminal charges, civil liability, and licensing board violations for multiple people. But we need to move carefully. The people implicated here have resources and they're going to fight back hard. He explained that we should take the recordings to the State Attorney General's office first, establish an official investigation, and then proceed with civil action. I contacted 6 other former Meadowbrook residents through social media that afternoon, people I'd known during my time there who'd experienced similar treatment. 5 of them responded within hours, all confirming their own experiences and expressing willingness to come forward if there was real evidence. One of them, a woman named Ashley Brennan, who'd been at Meadowbrook when she was 14, wrote back with details that made me feel sick. Kenneth was my uncle. That's why I got sent there, family placement. When I tried to tell anyone what he was doing, they said I was acting out because of family loyalty issues. Dr. Cross wrote in my file that I had borderline personality disorder and couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. I spent 3 years in psychiatric treatment after I left Meadowbrook, trying to convince therapists that my memories were real. She attached medical records showing the psychiatric diagnoses she'd received, all stemming from Dr. Cross's initial evaluation. I forwarded everything to David Nguyen, watching the case expand from my personal trauma into a pattern of systematic abuse affecting dozens of kids. Dr. Cross called my phone at 9 o'clock that evening, and I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with my own recorder running. Caleb, this is Dr. Cross. I want to apologize for how our last session ended. I think we both let emotions escalate, and I'd like to schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss your treatment plan moving forward. It's important that we handle this situation appropriately, and I'm concerned about the direction you're heading. Please call me back so we can talk about this like reasonable adults. Her voice was measured and professional again, but underneath it, I could hear the edge of panic. She knew I was serious about taking the recordings to authorities, and she was trying to control the situation. I didn't call her back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to David Nguyen with a note explaining that this was her attempting to reestablish therapeutic contact to discredit any accusations I might make. David responded immediately. Don't engage with her at all. Document everything, but don't respond. She's creating a paper trail to paint you as an unstable patient. The meeting with the Assistant Attorney General happened on a Friday morning in a conference room at the state office building downtown. I brought the hard drive, written documentation of my time at Meadowbrook, and David Nguyen brought legal precedent for similar cases. Assistant Attorney General Patricia Vance listened to several recordings, with a court reporter present, her expression growing more disturbed with each file. Mr. Reeves, these recordings are deeply troubling. However, I need to be transparent with you about the challenges we're facing. The statute of limitations on most of these incidents has expired. Kenneth Brenner died 6 years ago, which eliminates criminal prosecution there. Gary Westfield retired and moved to Florida. The facility itself closed 8 years ago after losing its state license for unrelated violations. She paused and looked at me directly. But Dr. Vivian Cross is still practicing, and her actions in attempting to discredit you as her patient based on her prior involvement with Meadowbrook constitute professional misconduct at minimum, possibly obstruction if we can prove she knew you were planning to report. Patricia Vance assigned an investigator to the case, a woman named Nicole Fraser, who specialized in institutional abuse cases. Nicole contacted me the following Monday, and we spent 6 hours going through every recording, creating a timeline of events and cross-referencing them with Meadowbrook's official records that the state had archived. The facility claimed they had no documented incidents of abuse during the years you were there, Nicole explained, pulling up digital files on her laptop. But your recordings prove there were dozens of incidents that staff either ignored or actively covered up. This is criminal negligence at minimum. She paused at one particularly damning recording where Gary Westfield explicitly told Kenneth Brenner to be more careful about leaving marks on residents. This is conspiracy. They knew abuse was happening, and they created a system to hide it. Nicole contacted the other former residents I'd put her in touch with, and within 2 weeks, she'd compiled testimony from 11 people who'd been at Meadowbrook during the same period I was there, all telling consistent stories of abuse, medical neglect, and psychological manipulation. The state licensing board moved faster than I expected. 3 weeks after I filed my initial complaint, Dr. Vivian Cross received notice that her clinical license was under investigation for ethical violations, patient exploitation, and professional misconduct. David Nguyen obtained a copy of the complaint through discovery, and reading it felt surreal. Dr. Cross engaged in therapeutic practice with a former resident of a facility where she had provided clinical services, failed to disclose this conflict of interest, attempted to discredit patient testimony that implicated her in institutional failures, and threatened patient with involuntary psychiatric commitment to suppress evidence of professional misconduct. The licensing board scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks out, and Dr. Cross hired one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the state. Her lawyer, Jeffrey Strand, sent a letter to David Nguyen, claiming that I had fabricated the recordings, that my mental health history made me an unreliable witness, and that his client had acted appropriately within therapeutic boundaries at all times. The preliminary hearing happened in a conference room with the 5-member licensing board seated at a long table, Dr. Cross and her attorney on one side, David Nguyen and I on the other. Jeffrey Strand presented his opening argument with practiced confidence, painting me as a troubled individual with a history of institutional placement and documented behavioral issues who'd become fixated on blaming others for my difficulties. Mr. Reeves has constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid taking responsibility for his own mental health challenges. My client provided ethical and competent care, and when confronted with patient delusions that implicated her professional history, she appropriately recommended higher-level psychiatric evaluation. He submitted psychiatric evaluations from 2 doctors he'd hired, who reviewed my file and concluded I showed signs of delusional disorder and factitious disorder. David Nguyen stood up and connected a laptop to the room's audio system. The defense can question Mr. Reeves's mental health all they want. Let's hear from Kenneth Brenner, Gary Westfield, and Dr. Cross herself. The first recording played, and I watched the licensing board members' faces change as they heard Kenneth Brenner's voice clearly threatening me, heard the fear in my 13-year-old voice begging him not to lock me in the basement, heard the door slam, and my subsequent hours of crying and panic. The board chair, Dr. Raymond Foster, held up his hand. Mr. Strand, does your client dispute the authenticity of this recording? Jeffrey Strand looked at Dr. Cross, who'd gone pale, and she leaned forward to her microphone. I don't recall that specific incident, but it's possible it occurred. However, my role at Meadowbrook was limited to providing psychological evaluations and treatment. I wasn't involved in disciplinary actions or day-to-day care. David Nguyen played the next recording, this one capturing Dr. Cross's voice speaking to another staff member about my file. I've documented behavioral dysregulation and authority defiance. If Caleb makes any accusations about staff treatment, his psychological profile will show he's not a credible informant. We need to protect the facility from litigation. Dr. Cross's attorney requested a recess, and they stepped out of the conference room into the hallway. Through the glass walls, I could see Jeffrey Strand talking intensely while Dr. Cross sat in a chair with her head in her hands. When they returned 20 minutes later, Strand's demeanor had changed completely. The board should know that my client was following institutional protocols at Meadowbrook. She was a junior psychologist completing her practicum under supervision. Any documentation she provided was at the direction of her supervisors. David Nguyen pulled out archived employment records. Dr. Cross was the senior psychologist at Meadowbrook during the final year Mr. Reeves was there. She supervised 2 interns. She reported directly to Gary Westfield. She had full authority over all psychological evaluations and treatment plans for residents. The licensing board asked Dr. Cross directly whether she'd known about abuse occurring at Meadowbrook. She was silent for a long moment, and then she admitted what I'd needed to hear for 15 years. I knew some staff members were too aggressive in their discipline. I documented concerns in my own notes. But I was young and I was afraid of losing my position. I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to report. The hearing lasted 4 more hours as David Nguyen systematically played recordings that demonstrated not just Dr. Cross's knowledge of abuse, but her active participation in covering it up. She'd altered psychological evaluations to make residents appear less credible. She'd coached staff on how to document incidents to avoid liability. She'd identified which kids were most likely to report abuse and flagged them as having oppositional or delusional tendencies. By the end of the day, Jeffrey Strand was negotiating damage control rather than defending her innocence. The licensing board deliberated for 45 minutes and returned with a preliminary decision. Dr. Raymond Foster read the statement with clear disgust in his voice. The board finds sufficient evidence of gross professional misconduct, patient harm, and ethical violations to warrant immediate suspension of Dr. Cross's clinical license pending a full investigation. Additionally, we're referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to obstruction of justice and patient abuse. Dr. Cross stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and walked out of the conference room without looking at anyone. Her attorney stayed behind to handle procedural matters, but the defeat was obvious. I sat there feeling something between vindication and exhaustion. 15 years of carrying this weight, finally acknowledged by people with power to do something about it. David Nguyen put his hand on my shoulder. This is just the beginning. We're filing civil suits against the state for licensing failures, against Meadowbrook's parent organization for institutional negligence, and we're pursuing criminal charges against every living administrator who participated in the cover-up. Your recordings are going to help a lot of other survivors get justice. That evening, local news ran a story about the licensing board hearing. Prominent therapist suspended after patient presents evidence of abuse cover-up was the headline, and by the next morning, it had spread to national outlets. My phone started ringing constantly with calls from journalists, other attorneys, and former Meadowbrook residents I hadn't heard from in years. The district attorney assigned a prosecutor named Lisa Mendez to review the case for potential criminal charges. She contacted me a week after the licensing board hearing, and we met at her office downtown. Mr. Reeves, what you've provided is the most comprehensive documentation of institutional abuse I've encountered in my career. The challenge is that many of the principals are deceased or beyond practical prosecution. However, Dr. Cross's actions as your therapist, attempting to suppress evidence, and threaten you with involuntary commitment, those constitute obstruction of justice and abuse of a patient relationship. We're moving forward with criminal charges. She explained that Dr. Cross would be charged with 3 felonies and multiple misdemeanors, carrying a potential sentence of 5 to 15 years if convicted. The criminal trial was scheduled for 8 months out, giving both sides time to prepare. Jeffrey Strand negotiated a plea deal where Dr. Cross would surrender her license permanently, accept probation, and avoid prison time, but Lisa Mendez rejected it. This isn't a case for backroom deals. This is about accountability for systematic abuse and cover-up spanning decades. And the media attention brought out other victims from institutions across the state. Nicole Fraser's investigation expanded to include 3 other group homes where similar patterns of abuse and psychological cover-up had occurred. One facility had employed Dr. Cross as a consultant for 2 years before Meadowbrook, and former residents there came forward with stories that mirrored my own. A woman named Diana Torres testified that Dr. Cross had diagnosed her with reactive attachment disorder after she reported sexual abuse by a staff member, effectively destroying her credibility for years. A man named Marcus Delgado described being told his memories of physical abuse were confabulations caused by post-traumatic stress, a diagnosis Dr. Cross had made to protect the facility. The pattern was undeniable and systematic, and Dr. Cross's professional reputation disintegrated under the weight of evidence. Universities removed her published research from their curricula. Professional organizations expelled her membership. Former colleagues issued statements distancing themselves from her work. The criminal trial started on a cold morning in November, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters and cameras. I testified on the second day, walking through my history at Meadowbrook, describing the abuse, explaining how Monica Reeves had given me the recorder, and detailing Dr. Cross's reaction when I'd revealed the recordings in our therapy session. Jeffrey Strand cross-examined me aggressively, trying to paint me as someone with mental health issues who'd misinterpreted innocent therapeutic interventions. Isn't it true, Mr. Reeves, that you've been diagnosed with anxiety disorder, depression, and PTSD? Isn't it possible that your trauma has colored your perception of Dr. Cross's attempts to help you? I looked directly at the jury as I answered. My trauma didn't color my perception. My trauma was documented in hundreds of hours of audio recordings showing exactly what happened to me. Dr. Cross tried to convince me those recordings didn't matter, that my memories were false, because she knew what they would reveal about her own actions. The prosecution played extended excerpts from the recordings, and I watched several jury members crying as they heard my 13-year-old voice begging Kenneth Brenner not to hurt me. Dr. Cross took the stand in her own defense, a decision her attorney clearly disagreed with based on his expression. She testified that she'd been young and overwhelmed at Meadowbrook, that she'd made mistakes, but never intended to harm anyone, and that her therapeutic approach with me had been appropriate given my presentation. When Caleb came to me with these detailed memories, I genuinely believed he was suffering from false memory syndrome. I was trying to help him separate fact from constructed narrative. The prosecution dismantled her testimony methodically, showing that she'd never disclosed her Meadowbrook connection when I became her patient, that she'd threatened me with psychiatric commitment after I revealed the recordings, and that she'd attempted to contact me after I'd left her practice to prevent me from going public. Lisa Mendez played the voicemail Dr. Cross had left me, her voice clearly attempting to manipulate me back into therapy where she could better control the narrative. Does that sound like a therapist concerned about her patient's well-being, or someone trying to protect herself from exposure? The jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 3 felony counts: obstruction of justice, abuse of patient relationship, and conspiracy to conceal criminal conduct. Judge Marianne Collins scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. And in that time, more information surfaced about the extent of Dr. Cross's cover-up. Investigators found that she'd maintained contact with Gary Westfield for years after leaving Meadowbrook, coordinating their stories about the facility's operations and identifying any former residents who might pose legal threats. She'd provided pro bono psychological evaluations for 3 former Meadowbrook residents, all concluding they had credibility issues related to personality disorders. She'd testified as an expert witness in 2 civil cases involving institutional abuse at other facilities, using her professional authority to cast doubt on survivor testimony. The web of her actions extended far beyond what I'd initially discovered, touching dozens of lives and systematically undermining justice for abuse survivors. At sentencing, Judge Collins listened to impact statements from 6 survivors whose lives had been damaged by Dr. Cross's professional misconduct. Ashley Brennan testified about spending years in psychiatric treatment for diagnoses Dr. Cross had invented to discredit her abuse reports. Daniel Kovac described watching friends destroyed by a system that Dr. Cross had helped weaponize against vulnerable children. Diana Torres explained how Dr. Cross's reactive attachment disorder diagnosis had followed her through multiple placements, marking her as a troubled child no one would believe. When it was my turn to speak, I brought the original voice recorder Monica Reeves had given me, the small pin-sized device that had preserved the truth when no one would listen. This recorder saved my life, not because it protected me from abuse while I was experiencing it, but because it gave me proof 15 years later when I finally found the courage to speak. Dr. Cross tried to take that proof away from me. She tried to convince me I was delusional, that my trauma was manufactured, that the recordings didn't matter. She did this to protect herself and the institution that enabled abuse for years. She did this knowing exactly what she was doing. Judge Collins sentenced Dr. Cross to 8 years in prison, the upper range of the sentencing guidelines. Dr. Cross, you occupied a position of profound trust, both as a psychologist at Meadowbrook and later as a therapist treating survivors of institutional trauma. You violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible, using your professional authority to silence victims and protect abusers. Your actions cause immeasurable harm to vulnerable individuals who came to you seeking help. This sentence reflects the gravity of your betrayal and the systematic nature of your misconduct. Dr. Cross showed no emotion as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Her attorney filed an appeal immediately, but the conviction held. The civil suits proceeded in parallel, with settlements totaling $18 million paid to former Meadowbrook residents by the state, the parent organization that had operated the facility, and Dr. Cross's professional liability insurance. Every dollar felt like validation, concrete acknowledgement that what had happened to us mattered. Monica Reeves contacted me 6 months after the trial, her voice breaking with emotion when I answered the phone. Caleb, I've been following everything in the news. I can't believe you kept that recorder all these years. I can't believe you had the courage to come forward. I thanked her for giving me the device that had ultimately brought justice, and she told me something I hadn't known. I gave recorders to 4 other kids at Meadowbrook. You're the only one who kept yours. The others either lost them or destroyed them because they were too painful to hold on to. You saved those recordings when it would have been easier to forget. That's extraordinary. She'd left social work years ago, burned out and disillusioned by a system that failed children more often than it protected them. But hearing about the trial and the convictions had inspired her to come back, to advocate for reforms that would prevent future Meadowbrooks from operating with impunity. We talked for over an hour about policy changes, mandatory reporting systems, and oversight mechanisms that could catch abuse before it became systematic. The state legislature passed new laws requiring annual independent audits of all group homes and residential facilities, creating a confidential hotline for abuse reports, and mandating that any mental health professional who works with institutionalized children must disclose that history if those children later become their patients. The laws were informally called the Meadowbrook Reforms, and I testified before the legislative committee about why they were necessary. Children in institutional care are among the most vulnerable people in our society. When the systems meant to protect them instead weaponize psychology and documentation to silence them, we create victims who carry trauma for decades. These reforms won't undo what happened to me and other Meadowbrook survivors, but they might prevent it from happening to the next generation. The laws passed unanimously, a rare moment of bipartisan agreement that abuse of children in state care was intolerable. David Nguyen framed a copy of the bill and gave it to me. You did this. Your courage to come forward, to preserve that evidence, to fight when everyone told you to stay quiet. This is your legacy. 2 years after Dr. Cross went to prison, I received a letter from her forwarded through her attorney. I almost threw it away without reading it, but something made me open it. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages of small, careful script. Mr. Reeves, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not writing to ask for it. I'm writing because you deserve to hear the truth from me directly, without lawyers or courtrooms or strategic considerations. Everything you accused me of was accurate. I knew about the abuse at Meadowbrook. I documented it in my personal notes but never reported it through official channels. I convinced myself I was protecting the facility's reputation, that exposing the abuse would hurt the children who needed placement there. But really, I was protecting my career. I was 27 years old, newly licensed, and terrified of being blacklisted as a troublemaker who couldn't work within institutional systems. When you came to me as my patient 15 years later, some part of me recognized your name from Meadowbrook files. I should have disclosed that immediately. Instead, I convinced myself I could help you by guiding you away from those memories, by reframing your trauma as something treatable rather than something that required accountability. When you produced the recordings, I panicked. Everything I'd spent years burying was suddenly on a hard drive you could hand to authorities. So I tried to discredit you, to have you committed, to protect myself one more time. I'm sorry. Those words are inadequate, but they're all I have. What I did to you and other Meadowbrook survivors was unconscionable. I became exactly what I'd sworn to fight against when I entered this profession. She signed it simply, Vivian Cross. I showed the letter to Daniel Kovac when we met for coffee the following week. He'd become a social worker specializing in foster care, using his experience to help current kids navigate systems that had failed us. What are you going to do with it? He asked, reading through the pages carefully. I'd been thinking about that question since the letter arrived. Nothing. It's not for me. It's for her. She needed to confess, to acknowledge what she did without the veneer of legal strategy. That's fine. But it doesn't change anything. She's still in prison. The survivors still have their settlements. The law is still passed. Her guilt or remorse is her own burden to carry. Daniel nodded slowly, folding the letter and handing it back to me. You know what's amazing about this whole thing? You were 13 years old with a pen recorder, scared and alone in an abusive facility, and you still found a way to document what was happening. That kid, that version of you who kept recording even when it seemed hopeless, he saved all of us. He made everything that came after possible. We talked about starting a nonprofit to provide legal support and documentation resources to kids in institutional care, giving them tools to protect themselves the way Monica Reeves had tried to protect me. 3 years after the trial, I enrolled in law school. David Nguyen had encouraged me to consider it, saying I had a natural understanding of how evidence worked and how to build cases that withstood scrutiny. I specialized in children's advocacy law, taking internships with organizations that represented kids in foster care, juvenile justice, and institutional settings. Every case I worked on, I thought about the voice recorder Monica had given me and how one small act of courage from an overworked social worker had changed everything. I thought about the responsibility that came with having proof, with being believed when so many others weren't. During my second year of law school, I gave a presentation about the Meadowbrook case at a national conference on institutional abuse. The room was packed with social workers, attorneys, child advocates, and policymakers. I played excerpts from the recordings I'd made as a 13-year-old, watching the audience react to hearing institutional abuse documented in real time. These recordings didn't just convict one therapist or expose one abusive facility. They proved that children in institutional care can be reliable witnesses to their own experiences. They showed that documentation matters, that evidence can overcome years of systematic discrediting, and that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. After the presentation, dozens of people approached me with their own stories of institutional abuse, of being disbelieved, of watching abusers evade accountability. Several of them asked if I'd consult on their cases, help them build the kind of evidentiary foundation that had made my case successful. I started a small consulting practice while finishing law school, advising attorneys and advocates on documentation strategies, evidence preservation, and how to navigate systems designed to protect institutions rather than victims. The work was emotionally exhausting, each case triggering memories of Meadowbrook and Dr. Cross's attempts to silence me. But it was also healing in a way I hadn't expected. Every kid I helped find their voice, every survivor who finally got justice, felt like honoring the 13-year-old version of myself who'd hidden a recorder in his pocket and pressed record even when everything seemed hopeless. The practice grew faster than I anticipated, and by the time I graduated law school, I had a small team helping me manage cases across multiple states. Dr. Cross was released from prison after serving 5 years of her 8-year sentence, her time reduced for good behavior and completion of rehabilitative programs. I learned about her release through a notification from the Victim Services Office, a standard courtesy for those who'd testified against her. The notification included information about her parole conditions, including permanent surrender of her clinical license, mandatory participation in restorative justice programs, and prohibition from working in any capacity involving vulnerable populations. I felt nothing when I read it, no anger or fear or satisfaction. She'd become irrelevant to my life, a historical figure whose actions had shaped my path but no longer had power over my present. I never responded to her letter, never sought further contact, never attended her parole hearings. She'd asked for forgiveness I wasn't interested in providing, and that was the end of our story. My story continued without her in it, built on the foundation of that small voice recorder and the truth it had preserved against all odds. I passed the bar exam and opened a practice focused exclusively on institutional abuse cases. The office was small, just me and 2 associates, but we took on cases other firms wouldn't touch because the opponents were too powerful or the evidence too circumstantial. We specialized in helping survivors find and preserve documentation, building cases that could withstand aggressive defense tactics, and navigating licensing boards and criminal systems. Every client who walked through our door reminded me of sitting in Dr. Cross's office with a hard drive containing proof that no one wanted to acknowledge. I made sure none of them left, feeling the way I had, dismissed and threatened and told their truth didn't matter. 5 years into practice, we'd won settlements for over 200 survivors of institutional abuse, secured criminal convictions against 12 administrators and staff members, and contributed to licensing board actions against 23 professionals who'd enabled or covered up abuse. The work never stopped being difficult, but it stopped being personal. I'd transformed my trauma into purpose, my evidence into expertise, and my silence into advocacy for others who couldn't yet speak. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.